They probably didn't tell you these things about your lathe. Hi, I'm Kent and welcome to Turn a Wood Bowl. Today I'm going to go over 7 things they probably didn't share with you before you got your new lathe, or if you got a used lathe that's new to you now. There are some things that most people don't know to discuss with you, and you're not going to know these things until you've had a little bit of experience, but I'm going to share them with you today, and there are 7 of them. Now, if you're like me, when you first got your lathe, it was super exciting. The anticipation of knowing that it's on its way, you've made your decision, you've made your purchase, and that lathe is coming to you. Or if you've gotten a hand-me-down used lathe, either way, it's super exciting. You start thinking about all of the things you want to make and all the ideas and plans and how exciting it's going to be and how it might be a little bit intimidating to learn how to turn properly. All of those things make it super fun time, but there are at least 7 things that nobody talks about, and we're going to go over those today. So let's dive right in and start off with tip number 1. Okay, tip number 1 on the things they probably didn't tell you is spindle turning and bowl turning are totally different. Yes, they can both be done on the same lathe, but they are completely different in a variety of different ways. Let's start off with speeds and rotation speeds or turning speeds with the lathe. Spindle turning can be turned much faster than bowl turning. Why? Well, you have a smaller mass around a tighter axis compared to a larger bowl. Now, I've got a video all about lathe speeds, and I'll put a link up there, I believe, for you. You can check that out after you watch this video. But lathe speeds are dramatically different between spindle turning and wood bowl turning. We do not want to go super fast when we're turning a wood bowl, especially if we start off with a bowl blank that is irregular, that needs to be trued up on the lathe. It's going to have an imbalance to it and you're going to have vibrations. So we're going to start off with very slow speeds initially, and as that bowl blank becomes more true, then we can increase the speed from that point. But we can't start off really fast like we can with spindle turning. So spindle turning and bowl turning speeds are different. Tools are different as well. Spindle tools and bowl gouge tools are different. Now, a bowl gouge can be used in spindle turning without a problem, but there are many spindle tools that should not be used when turning a wood bowl. And I also have a video on that, so check that out as well. But in general, what you want to know is spindle tools are for spindle turning, and wood bowl tools, well, primarily the bowl gouge is used mostly for turning wood bowls. And one of the biggest culprits is the spindle in the title, remember that, spindle roughing gouge. Spindle roughing gouge is great on spindle turnings, but you never want to use this when turning a bowl. This shank in the bottom of this tool is not designed to handle the stress and the pressures that you will encounter when turning a wood bowl. So make sure that you're not using your spindle tools when turning wood bowls. Now, if you want to use a bowl gouge on a spindle turning, that's not a problem. The bowl gouges are made extra tough to handle bowl turning, and they'll also work with spindle turning as well. Spindle turning and wood bowl turning techniques, the way you use your tools and the way you make particular cuts, are also very different from one another. There are some similarities, but they're also very different from one another. Spindle turning is typically end-to-end turning. That means the grain of the wood is running along with the bed lathe, and that will require different supported grain cuts than a side grain mounted bowl blank. Most bowl blanks are turned with side grain mounted wood, and that's going to have extra stresses, and you're going to have different supported grain directions to cut. And yep, I got a video all on that too, so check that out. And I'm going to put a list of these down in the description below. You can check them out after you've seen this whole video. For tip 1, just know that spindle turning and wood bowl turning are not the same. The second thing that they probably never told you about your lathe is that a direct drive lathe or a direct belt driven lathe and a variable speed lathe are different from one another, and a variable speed lathe is preferable for wood bowl turning. Now, some of the older lathes and some of the smaller bench style lathes are just belt driven, and they have a variety of different belts and pulleys that you can adjust them to. When we're turning bowls, we want to adjust the belt to the slowest speed, which also gives us the most torque, which is also beneficial for turning bowls. We need that extra force and that power when we start making our bowl gouge cuts, and we're going to need that. The only problem is you need to be aware that some of the direct drive belt and pulley lathes, their slowest speed is actually very fast for bowl turning. Many of those RPMs are around 1,000 or 1,200 RPMs, and that's higher than we want to turn ever. The maximum speed we want to turn is around 1,000 RPMs, and that's if the bowl blank is perfectly balanced and symmetrical. When we start off with a roughed bowl blank, we want to be at speeds that are down in the maybe in the 400 to 500 RPM, depending on how unbalanced that blank is. If you put an unbalanced blank on a direct drive, direct pulley and belt system and turn it on at full speed at 1,000 RPMs, there's a good chance it's going to vibrate violently and dislodge and come flying off the piece. Instead, what we really want is we want a variable speed. We want to be able to control that. A lot of the lathes have variable speed, and that's what you really want for bowl turning. Now, if you do have a direct drive belt and pulley lathe and you can't change the speed and vary the speed and control it, you just want to make sure that when you're turning bowls, you have really nice, perfectly balanced blanks that you start with. This is going to give you the best chance for very little vibration when you're turning. If you start off with something that's a raw chunk of wood or a raw log, you're going to have problems. Now, another option that's available, now I haven't tried this myself, but I've heard of many people doing this, is to have a third-party variable control speed switch installed into your lathe so that you can control that motor speed and slow it down and speed it up. But you're still going to want to take that belt and put it on the slowest speed with the most torque so you have the most power from your motor when you're turning. Tip number 3 of what they probably didn't tell you. Do I have to buy the same brand for all of my accessories? Does it have to match my lathe? Now, it's really common for there to be companies that make accessories such as chucks that also make lathes. A common misunderstanding is that you really need to get the chuck that matches your lathe. Well, that's not necessarily true. Now, while it's nice that a company can make a lathe, also makes chucks and makes other accessories, not all lathe manufacturers make additional accessories, and not all accessory companies make lathes. So how does that all work? Well, the only thing you need to do is you need to match your headstock spindle size. Your headstock spindle size is a fixed diameter and thread length, and that's how it's measured. For instance, I have a 1 1/4 diameter by 8 threads per inch headstock spindle. As long as all my accessories match that, then I won't have any problems. And I can mix and match brands all I want as long as they fit the same size. And also the hole in the headstock spindle is called the Morris taper. That is a friction fit connection where there's a shaft that has the same Morris taper on it that can be attached to that insert, and it's attached to the lathe. Most of those are Morris taper 2s. Some of the smaller lathes and smaller headstocks might have a Morris taper 1, and those are noted as MT1 or MT2. Most lathes are MT2s, but you want to check that as well. So the headstock spindle size and the Morris taper size are what you really want to concentrate. And as long as any accessory from any company matches those sizes, you should be able to use it on your lathe. Now, another note on this subject, if you have other accessories from a different lathe that are not the same size, they do make adapters. For instance, this is a reducer that goes from 1 1/4 down to a 1-inch spindle. So I have a couple accessories from an older lathe that I have that were 1 inch. Well, I can attach those to my lathe using this adapter. And there are many different adapters that are available out there. You just want to be careful when you're using adapters and extensions from the headstock that you don't want to make those too long and take your turning too far away from the headstock, because it makes it a lot easier to introduce vibration. If that were the case, it's much better to invest the extra money and get a chuck that matches your headstock, or a faceplate. It can be any accessory. It doesn't really matter what it is. Just make sure that you're as close to that headstock as possible when you're doing your turnings. That way you have the better chance to have very little vibration in your turnings. If you're liking this video, do me a favor and smash that like button for me. Thank you. Also, if you're enjoying these tips and you want many more, I've got an online PDF printable book that you can download right now. It's called 21 Pitfalls of Wood Bowl Turning and How to Avoid Them. And some of the tips that I'm sharing in this video are in there, plus many more. And if you want to avoid some troubles and make your life a lot easier when it comes to turning wood bowls, go check out my ebook right now. Tip number 4, which they probably didn't tell you, is there's a difference between a drive center and a live center. A drive center is a stationary piece of metal that has no movements in it whatsoever. And a live center has bearings and it can rotate. Now, what's the difference? Well, if we want to drive our rotation of our bowl blank, we need to use a drive center. And that's going to be a solid piece of metal. That metal goes into the Morse taper connection of your headstock spindle, and because it doesn't have any rotating parts, it's going to take the rotation from the lathe and drive your turning. It's that simple. On the other end of the lathe, in the tailstock, that is where you want your live center. This is simply going to be holding your piece in place, but it needs to rotate when the lathe's on. That kind of makes sense, but these are very confusing and nobody talks about this. And it's really easy to stick one in the tailstock and one in the headstock and maybe get them backwards. Now, what happens if you get them backwards? Well, first off, if you put a live center in the headstock or into the motor end of the lathe, what's going to happen is it's just going to rotate. So if you have a bowl blank on there, it's not going to rotate. It may turn a little bit, but it's not going to rotate because the bearings in the live center are going to turn against the lathe, and it's not going to give you enough friction to get the bowl blank turning. Now, if you take the drive center and you put this in the tailstock, it might rotate inside the Morse taper in your tailstock, and it's going to create a lot of friction and heat and potentially could damage the Morse taper in the tailstock. And if it locks into the tailstock and doesn't rotate in the quill, then it's probably going to drill a hole in the tail end stock of your bowl blank because it's stationary while the bowl blank is rotating around it. So you really want to make sure you have the drive center on the headstock or connected to the lathe, and you want to have the live center attached to the tailstock. Super important, really simple. I hardly ever hear anybody talk about it. Another thing that hardly ever gets talked about is how do you attach a bowl blank to the lathe? There are actually several different ways you can do this, and I've found 2 that work really well for me. The first one is using a faceplate. This is how I started. I turned a lot of bowls using a faceplate. Now, this is a great way to start, especially if you're just getting started with turning wood bowls, because it's very secure and it's very stable. And I hate saying these things, but I've never had a bowl come off the lathe that was attached to a faceplate. You want to make sure that you have screws that are long enough that come out. The rule of thumb is the screw should extend. You should be able to count 7 threads coming out of that. And the big thing is you want to make sure that you're not using drywall screws. Drywall screws are thin and brittle, and they have the ability to snap off. You want to make sure you're using wood screws or a good quality wood screw of some sort that's thicker, not a drywall screw. If you're using the faceplate, if you're just starting off, I highly recommend using the faceplate. That's going to give you a very secure connection. Now, another way to mount a bowl to the lathe is to use a drive center. A drive center needs to accompany the tailstock, and you need a live center in the tailstock. And when these two come together, you have a really good connection. Now, this isn't necessarily the best connection to start out with if you're just learning, because you may have some issues with that. It's one of those, once you know how to turn a little bit better, after you've used the faceplate for a while, then you can start using a drive center. The advantages of using a drive center is that you can reposition a bowl blank very easily just by loosening the tailstock, repositioning the bowl blank, and then continuing turning. If you screw the faceplate into a bowl blank, it's a little bit more difficult to readjust it just a little bit here or there, and without doing a lot of work, taking all the screws out and then leveling it off or chiseling off the wood and then repositioning the faceplate. But it's pretty easy to do those quick adjustments with a drive center. So those are just two ways, and there are other ways. I've got a video that shows 3 different ways to attach a bowl blank to the lathe. I'll put a link of that up here. You want to check that out. And it goes into much more detail than we can cover right here. Tip number 6 of things they probably didn't tell you is, what height do you need to set your lathe? Well, if you have a freestanding lathe that has a base with adjustable legs, you can raise or lower your lathe. That's great. Sometimes there's bench models that's a little more difficult to do. But essentially, the rule of thumb is you want to be able to cross your arms, put your hands on your shoulders, and your elbow should be very close to the headstock height. And that's kind of a general rule of thumb. Now, what you need to be paying attention to is, are you comfortable when you're turning? Do you notice that you're hunched over or you're reaching up perhaps? You want to pay attention to those things, and you may need to adjust your lathe accordingly. You especially don't want to turn for several hours and have back pains or shoulder pains, things like that. You want to pay attention to that. If you're feeling those, then you need to be aware that you might be able to correct that by simply changing the height of your lathe. Now, some people are a little bit shorter, and it's difficult to get the lathe adjusted properly or get up to the level. You can make a small platform to stand on, and I recommend making a small platform to experiment with first to make sure you get the height right. And then if you have a little bit more permanent situation, if you have a lathe at home that you work at all the time and you can't get the lathe from the manufacturer, the legs adjusted to the height you need, then you could build a platform. I've seen many people do this. They'll build a small platform, basically raise the floor up however high it needs to be, and that's where you need to test it ahead of time to know where you need to be when you're turning. And then you can build a small platform all the way around your lathe so you're at that height and it's ready to go. So you just want to make sure that you've got the height where you're comfortable. Just pay attention as you're turning, and if you notice any aches or pains or anything that doesn't seem right, then make adjustments and either raise or lower your lathe legs to accommodate that. Tip number 7 of things they probably didn't tell you is lathe vibration. Should there be vibration in your lathe? Probably not. First of all, start off with nothing mounted to the lathe. Turn your lathe on and bring the speed up. The only thing spinning should be your headstock with nothing attached to it. There should be 0 vibration. If there's vibration, check your base, make sure the base is stable, make sure everything is attached securely. If you've got a base unit with legs that are bolted to your lathe, make sure everything's bolted tight and everything's secure. There should be 0 vibration when your lathe is running with nothing attached to it. If that's the case, great. When you have a bowl blank attached to it, you need to bring the speed up slowly. And again, this is if you have a variable speed lathe, bring the speed up until you just start noticing vibration, and then bring the speed down just a bit. That should be the comfortable place where you start turning. I teach that in the video that I have all about lathe speed and understanding the proper speeds, and you want to check that video out because that video goes into great detail about what is the proper speed for your lathe. But essentially, if you have a bowl blank on the lathe, you want to bring that speed up slowly until you feel a little bit of vibration and back the speed down. Now, what does that mean? Well, guess what? If you've got a chunk of wood, a log that's been cut in half and it's rough, it's got square corners, and you're going to round all that out on the lathe, that thing is going to be wobbling all over the place initially. That's why you have to have it slow at first. And you're going to feel vibration from that. That's normal. But what you want to do is, as you're turning it and you're shaping it into the shape of a bowl, then you want to slowly bring the speed up. And again, you work right up to that point where there's vibration, and then it comes back down. Bring the speed down a little bit so you don't have that vibration. You do not want to be turning a bowl and actually making cuts while there's vibration in the lathe. That's a big no-no. Now, if there's vibration from your faceplate, the chuck, or the headstock at any given moment, there might be a problem with your lathe that you need to get checked out. And I would contact the manufacturer of the lathe and see if there's something that you need to do from that end. Now, if you have a lathe that keeps giving you problems as far as moving or vibrating and sliding, the other thing you need to be aware is if you get enough vibration, or if you put a bowl blank on there that's large and it's off balance, it can move an entire lathe. It can make the lathe vibrate enough and start walking across the floor. You need to be aware of that. One of the ways I remedy that for my lathe is I take little rubber square mats, little pieces of my mat that I stand on. I've cut those off the same size as the foot of my lathe, and I've stuck them under there. They're about a 1/2 inch, or what would that be, 12 millimeters thick pieces of rubber, and they've compressed underneath the feet, and it takes out any little small gaps. So any little minimal vibrations are removed from that. So use some type of spacer if you need to under the legs of your lathe to reduce any small vibrations. But in general, you do not want to have vibration when you're turning bowls. So there are 7 things that people don't usually tell you before you get a lathe, whether it's a new lathe or a used lathe or new to you lathe. Most people don't discuss these things, and it's not that they're trying to hide it, it's just that it's either not thought of or it's believed to be common knowledge. And a lot of these things aren't common knowledge until you figure them out the hard way. And I'm trying to help you guys out so you don't have to figure these things out the hard way. Leave me a comment and let me know which of these they probably didn't tell you tips connected with you the most, or was the most eye-opening for you. And while you're down there, do me a favor and click that like button and make sure you're subscribing. Also, if you're interested in turning wood bowls, or if you're curious about it, you've got to check out my website, turnawoodbowl.com. Turnawoodbowl.com is loaded with articles about nothing other than turning wood bowls. That's it. It's just wood bowl turning. So if you're curious, if you're having troubles on a particular topic, or if you want to learn more about something is regarding wood bowl turning, the answer is most likely there. And if it's not, I'm going to write another article and I'll make sure that it is there. There are over 100 articles on that website specifically about turning wood bowls. So make sure you check out turnawoodbowl.com. And until next time, as always, happy turning.